The air in rural Virginia, in the autumn of 1835, was thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. But on the sprawling hemlock plantation, a different, more cloying odor had taken root. It was a foul, organic stench that clung to the back of the throat, a miasma of decay that seemed to emanate from one specific, shadowed corner of the estate. Sheriff Miles Blackwood felt it the moment he stepped out of his carriage. His boots sank into the muddy lane, the silence of the place pressing in on him. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, watchful quiet, the kind that follows a scream. He'd been summoned by the plantation owner, Thaddeus Hemlock, a man of considerable influence whose wife, Alara, had vanished without a trace 2 weeks prior. The search parties had found nothing. The dogs had lost her scent at the edge of the dark woods. It was as if the very soil had swallowed her whole. But the servants whispered. And their whispers, like the foul smell, had begun to drift beyond the property line. Blackwood bypassed the grand porch of the main house, his gaze fixed on the dilapidated structure in the distance, the pigsty. The smell was stronger here, a horrifying perfume of filth and something else, something sickly sweet. The pigs, massive and pink-eyed, watched him with an unnerving intelligence as they rooted through the muck. The men with him kept their distance, handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. Blackwood, however, stepped closer, his eyes scanning the churned, muddy ground. He was looking for a sign, a clue, anything to cut through the wall of silence and fear that choked this plantation. And then he saw it. A faint glint of gold, half submerged in the filth. He knelt, using a stick to pry it from the sucking mud. It was a locket, finely crafted, ornate, but now tarnished and cold. He pried it open. The tiny portraits inside were shattered, but he could just make out the faded likeness of a man and a woman. He recognized it instantly from the description Thaddeus had given. It belonged to Alara Hemlock. The horrifying implications began to crystallize, a dreadful narrative taking shape in the oppressive silence. This wasn't just a case of a missing person. It was something far more macabre. To understand the chilling discovery in the mud, one must first understand the world of Whispering Pines, the Hemlock family's dominion. In 1835, it was a kingdom built on tobacco and human suffering, ruled by Thaddeus Hemlock in name, but governed by the iron will of his wife, Alara. From a distance, she was the epitome of Southern aristocracy: porcelain skin, hair the color of spun gold, and gowns of imported silk that rustled as she moved. She was an object of envy and admiration in the county, a perfect hostess whose smile was as bright as it was brittle. But within the borders of her own home, that smile was a harbinger of storms. The servants knew her not for her beauty, but for the cold, calculating cruelty that lurked behind her crystalline blue eyes. Her moods were a treacherous tide, capable of turning from placid calm to a raging tempest with no warning. A misplaced teacup, a speck of dust on the mahogany, a moment of perceived insolence, any of it could trigger a punishment that was both swift and inventive in its viciousness. The stories of her cruelty were a forbidden currency among the enslaved, exchanged in hushed tones in the darkness of the cabins, far from the ears of the main house. They spoke of the hummingbird cage, a small, cramped box in the smokehouse where servants were left for days for minor infractions. They whispered of the salt cure, where lashes were followed by brine being rubbed into the wounds. Alara Hemlock did not merely demand obedience. She seemed to derive a deep, disturbing pleasure from the complete and utter subjugation of those she considered her property. She was a woman who saw the world as her personal stage, and everyone else as mere props to be moved, used, and discarded at her whim. This plantation wasn't a home. It was a crucible of fear, and Alara was the flame. And every soul trapped within her orbit understood that to draw her attention was to risk being burned to ashes. Among the many souls who moved through the shadows of the Hemlock house, none was closer to the flame than Grace. She was Alara's personal housemaid, a position that was both a privilege and a curse. It spared her from the back-breaking labor of the fields, but it placed her in the direct path of her mistress's volatile temper, 24 hours a day. Grace was young, barely 20, with quiet hands and eyes that held a depth of sorrow far beyond her years. She was a ghost in the house, her movements silent and efficient, her presence designed to be felt but not seen. She learned to anticipate Alara's needs before they were spoken, to read the subtle shifts in her mistress's breathing, the slight tightening of her lips that signaled an impending rage. Grace dressed her, bathed her, brushed her long golden hair, and stood silently in the corner of the room while she slept. She was the keeper of Alara's intimate world, privy to her vanities, her insecurities, and her boundless capacity for malice. The relationship was a macabre intimacy, a forced symbiosis of oppressor and oppressed. A typical morning might involve Alara complaining that Grace had pulled a single hair too hard while brushing, a complaint that would earn Grace a sharp slap across the face. An afternoon might see Alara, bored and restless, forcing Grace to stand perfectly still for an hour, holding a heavy silver tray, simply to watch her arms tremble with exhaustion. These were the daily cuts, the slow, methodical erosion of a human spirit. Grace absorbed it all with a stoicism that was both her shield and her curse. She never cried, never flinched, never gave her mistress the satisfaction of a visible reaction. Her face remained a placid, unreadable mask, but behind that mask, a pressure was building. Every cruel word, every casual act of violence was a drop of poison in a vessel that was slowly, inevitably, filling to the brim. The year 1835 was a time suspended between an old world and a new one. In the bustling cities of the North, the whispers of abolition were growing louder, a distant drumbeat of change. But in the secluded, sun-drenched plantations of rural Virginia, time seemed to move differently. Here, the institution of slavery was not just an economic system. It was a law of nature, a divinely ordained hierarchy etched into the very landscape. Life was governed by the seasons, the price of tobacco, and a rigid social code that was as unforgiving as the summer heat. Plantations like Whispering Pines were isolated fiefdoms, worlds unto themselves, often miles of dense, untamed forest away from the nearest town. This isolation bred a unique kind of paranoia and superstition. The woods were believed to be home to spirits and dark entities, and curses were as real as cottonmouth snakes. It was a world where folklore and reality were deeply intertwined. A strange sickness in the livestock could be blamed on a hex. A child's nightmare was the work of a malevolent spirit. This deep-seated belief in the supernatural existed alongside the brutal, man-made horror of slavery, creating a psychological landscape thick with dread. Justice was a subjective and often violent affair, administered by plantation owners who were law, judge, and jury on their own land. A vanished mistress was a grave matter, but the fate of a servant was of little consequence to the outside world. This was the suffocating reality that the people of Whispering Pines inhabited, a place of immense natural beauty that concealed a disturbing, foundational ugliness. The air itself felt heavy with unspoken secrets, the weight of generations of suffering pressing down on the living. It was a perfect breeding ground for a tragedy, a place where the lines between sanity and madness, justice and vengeance, could easily become blurred beyond recognition. The day Alara Hemlock vanished began like any other. The morning was humid, the air still and expectant of a coming storm. Thaddeus Hemlock had departed 2 days prior for Richmond, a business trip that was expected to last the week. His absence always left a vacuum in the house, one that Alara often filled with an escalated campaign of petty cruelties. On this particular morning, her fury was directed at Grace. The source of her anger was trivial, a perceived stain on a lace collar, but the punishment was not. Witnesses, the other house servants, would later speak of Alara dragging Grace to the courtyard and publicly cutting off a length of her hair with shears, a deep and personal humiliation. Alara then dismissed her, her rage seemingly spent, and retired to her chambers. That was the last time anyone admitted to seeing her. As the afternoon wore on, her absence became noticeable. She missed her midday meal, an unheard-of breach of her own rigid routine. The cook, a woman named Hattie, sent a young boy to her door, but he received no answer. By evening, a quiet, nervous energy had settled over the house. The servants moved with a hesitant uncertainty. Was this another one of the mistress's games, a test of their obedience, or was something genuinely wrong? They offered mundane explanations to each other in hushed tones. Perhaps she had taken a horse and gone for a long ride to cool her temper. Perhaps a neighbor had called on her unexpectedly. But as night fell and the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, lashing the plantation with wind and rain, a genuine fear began to seep through the walls of the great house. Ilara was terrified of thunderstorms. She would never have been caught out in one. The excuses wore thin, replaced by a chilling, unspoken question. The mistress of Whispering Pines, a woman whose presence was as powerful and oppressive as the summer heat itself, had simply vanished. For 2 days, a fragile illusion of normalcy was maintained. The house staff performed their duties in a state of suspended anxiety, waiting for the familiar sound of Alara's sharp voice to cut through the quiet. But the silence only deepened. When Thaddeus Hemlock's carriage finally rolled up the long drive, returning him from his business in the city, he was met not by his wife on the porch, but by a household on the verge of panic. The news of Alara's disappearance struck him like a physical blow. A man accustomed to order and control, he was thrust into a situation of absolute uncertainty. His initial reaction was disbelief, which quickly curdled into a furious, panicked energy. He immediately organized search parties. Overseers, field hands, and neighboring plantation owners with their hounds were assembled. They fanned out from the main house, a small army swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. They combed through the dense, tangled woods that bordered the property, their calls echoing unanswered through the ancient trees. They dragged the slow-moving river that snaked along the southern edge of the estate. The search was relentless, fueled by Thaddeus's growing desperation. But the land held its secrets close. The hounds, usually so reliable, seemed confused, circling aimlessly before losing the trail completely near a patch of swampy, overgrown marshland. The woods yielded no clues, no torn fabric, no footprints, no sign of a struggle. The river gave up nothing but murky water. After 3 days of exhaustive searching, the effort began to wane. The hope that had initially driven them was replaced by a grim resignation. It was as if Alara Hemlock had not been taken, but erased, as if she had walked to the edge of the known world and stepped into nothingness. The vast, silent wilderness surrounding Whispering Pines had become a suspect in itself, a green monster that had seemingly devoured the mistress of the house. With the failure of the external search, the focus of the investigation contracted, turning inward like a closing fist. The sprawling fields and forests had offered no answers, so the mystery had to lie within the confines of the plantation itself, within the walls of the house and the hearts of its inhabitants. Thaddeus Hemlock, his face etched with a mixture of grief and suspicion, began to question the servants himself. His interrogations were clumsy, fueled by rage. He was met with a wall of frightened, downcast eyes and trembling, evasive answers. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. They offered only the story of the morning's argument, the public humiliation of Grace, and the subsequent silence. It was a frustrating, maddening dead end. The servants' fear was palpable, but was it fear of their master's wrath, or fear of concealing a darker truth? To Thaddeus, it all looked like guilt. His suspicion, like a wandering spotlight, began to settle on one figure who seemed unnervingly out of place in the landscape of panic and grief. While others wept or whispered fearfully, Grace remained a pillar of unnatural calm. She went about her duties with the same quiet efficiency as always, her expression unreadable. This composure, which had once been her survival mechanism, now appeared deeply sinister. Why was she not afraid? Why did she not weep for the mistress she had served so intimately? In the absence of evidence, her stoicism became a confession. The whispers among the other servants, once focused on Alara's cruelty, now shifted to Grace's strange demeanor. All eyes, from the master in the great house to the field hands in the farthest tobacco row, were now fixed on the young housemaid. The first, tentative seeds of a horrifying accusation had been planted in the fertile ground of fear and suspicion. When it became clear that Thaddeus Hemlock's own investigation was collapsing into incoherent rage, Sheriff Miles Blackwood was formally summoned. Blackwood was not a man given to flights of fancy. He was methodical, patient, and possessed a grim understanding of the darkness that could fester in isolated places like this. He arrived not with the bluster of a plantation master, but with the quiet authority of the law. He listened to Thaddeus's rambling, grief-stricken account, nodding slowly, his eyes missing nothing. He then began his own, more structured process. He knew that memory is a fragile thing, easily warped by fear or influence. His first order of business was to establish a firm, unshakable timeline of Alara Hemlock's last known day. He did not conduct his interviews in the intimidating grand parlor of the main house, but in a small, neutral office in one of the outbuildings. He spoke to each servant individually, from the head cook down to the youngest stable boy. His voice was low and steady, a stark contrast to their master's fury. He asked simple questions. What time did you wake? Where were you when the storm began? Who was the last person you saw speak with the mistress? He painstakingly pieced together the fragments of their accounts, cross-referencing their stories, searching for inconsistencies. He was not just listening to what they said, but how they said it. He noted the nervous glances, the trembling hands, the stories that sounded too rehearsed. He was building a map of the day, a chart of movements and moments, convinced that somewhere within this intricate web of fear and duty lay the key to Alara's disappearance. The initial picture was the one Thaddeus had already formed, a morning of cruelty, followed by an afternoon of unsettling silence. But Blackwood knew that the truth was rarely on the surface. It had to be dug for. As Sheriff Blackwood delved deeper, he moved beyond the simple timeline and began to probe the complex social ecosystem of the plantation. He wanted to understand the relationships, the tensions, the currents of resentment that flowed beneath the surface of enforced servitude. It was during his conversation with Hattie, the elderly cook, that he first heard the full, unvarnished truth of Alara's forbidden temper. Hattie, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on the floor, spoke of a cruelty that went far beyond sharp words or occasional slaps. She recounted tales that made the sheriff's blood run cold, stories of calculated psychological torture and physical abuse that were a daily reality for the staff. The sheriff then learned the true nature of the incident that had occurred on the morning Alara vanished. It was not just about a stained collar. Alara had accused Grace of stealing a small, pearl-inlaid music box, an heirloom from Alara's mother. Despite Grace's tearful denials, Alara had refused to believe her. She had torn Grace's small, meager quarters apart in a furious search. When she couldn't find it, she didn't relent. Instead, she took her fury to the courtyard. The public shearing of Grace's hair was not just a punishment. It was a deliberate act of dehumanization, a ritual of shame performed in front of everyone. Hattie explained that for a woman like Grace, who had so little, her dignity was one of her few remaining possessions. Alara had not just cut her hair, she had tried to sever her spirit. A few hours later, the missing music box was found. It had fallen behind Alara's own dressing table. She never apologized. This new detail changed everything. It provided a motive, a powerful one. It painted a picture not of a random disappearance, but of a potential final, desperate act of rebellion born from an unbearable injustice. Armed with a clear motive, Sheriff Blackwood summoned Grace for a formal interrogation. She entered the small office, her movements measured, her face an impassive mask. She sat opposite him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The sheriff, accustomed to reading guilt and fear in a suspect's eyes, found nothing in hers. It was like looking into the still, dark water of a deep well. He began calmly, asking her to recount the events of the day her mistress vanished. Grace's story was simple, direct, and delivered in a soft, even monotone. She spoke of the argument over the music box, the punishment in the courtyard, and her subsequent retreat to the kitchens to help Hattie. She claimed she had remained there for the rest of the day and that she knew nothing of Alara's whereabouts. Her answers were concise, offering no extraneous detail. There was no tremor in her voice, no flicker of fear in her gaze. It was this absolute control that Blackwood found so deeply disturbing. It was unnatural. A young woman accused of involvement in the disappearance of her powerful and cruel mistress should be terrified. She should be weeping or hysterical or defensively angry. Grace was none of those things. She was a void, an unnerving pocket of calm in the center of a storm. The sheriff pressed her, his questions becoming more pointed, more accusatory. He described the pain and humiliation she must have felt. He tried to provoke a reaction, to find a crack in her placid facade. But Grace simply absorbed his words, her expression unchanging. It was as if the girl who had suffered the punishment and the girl sitting before him were two entirely different people. This interview, meant to break her, only served to harden Blackwood's suspicion. This was not the composure of an innocent person. It was the chilling, impenetrable stillness of someone with a secret too horrifying to confess. If you are intrigued by these forbidden histories, where the darkest corners of the past are brought to light, consider subscribing to this channel. The deeper we go into this case, the more macabre the truth becomes. The interrogation had been a failure. Grace's silence was a fortress that Sheriff Blackwood could not breach. Frustrated, he turned his attention from the person to the place. If she wouldn't speak, perhaps her living space would. He ordered a thorough search of Grace's quarters, a small, windowless room at the back of the servants' wing. It was a sparse, almost monastic space, containing little more than a thin straw mattress on a wooden frame, a small crate for a table, and a few items of worn clothing hanging from a peg. Two of the master's men, accompanied by the sheriff, began the search. They were brutal in their efficiency, tearing the mattress open, spilling the straw onto the floor. They pried up the floorboards, searching for a hidden cavity. They ran their hands along the rough-hewn walls, looking for loose stones or secret compartments. They found nothing. There was no sign of a struggle, no hidden weapon, not a single spot of blood. The room was as clean and empty as Grace's confession. It was a testament to a life lived with nothing, a life devoid of personal possessions. But just as they were about to give up, tucked away in a corner of the emptied crate, the sheriff found a small object. It was a crudely carved wooden bird, no bigger than his thumb. Its lines were simple, but there was a surprising grace to its form, its wings poised as if for flight. In this grim, oppressive environment, this tiny, hand-carved object felt like a profound act of defiance. It was a symbol of a spirit that sought to fly, a small piece of beauty created in a world of ugliness. It told Blackwood that while Grace's world was one of emptiness, her inner life was not. There was a mind at work here, a will capable of creation. And he couldn't help but wonder, with a chilling sense of foreboding, what else that same will might be capable of. Days turned into a week and the investigation stalled. The mystery of Alara Hemlock was rapidly becoming what lawmen of a later era would call a cold case. In 1835, the tools of forensic science were non-existent. There was no fingerprinting, no blood analysis, no sophisticated methods of evidence collection. An investigation rested almost entirely on three pillars: physical evidence visible to the naked eye, witness testimony, and most crucially, a confession. Sheriff Blackwood had none of these. The vast plantation had yielded no body. The witness testimonies were a circular maze of fear and speculation, and the prime suspect was a silent, unreadable enigma. Thaddeus Hemlock's grief was souring into a bitter, impatient fury. He wanted answers, and more than that, he wanted someone to punish. He put immense pressure on the sheriff, threatening to use his influence in Richmond to have him removed if he couldn't solve the case. Blackwood was caught between the master's demands for swift justice and the profound lack of actual proof. The entire county was now buzzing with rumor and speculation. Some believed Alara had simply run off with a secret lover, a theory Thaddeus furiously rejected. Others whispered that she had stumbled upon a group of runaway slaves in the woods and been killed. But the most persistent, most insidious rumor was the one that centered on the quiet housemaid. The story of Grace's humiliation was now common knowledge, and in the court of public opinion, a motive was as good as a conviction. Yet, without a body, without a weapon, without a single shred of concrete evidence, the law was powerless. The case was a perfect, horrifying vacuum. Alara Hemlock had vanished from the face of the earth, and the chilling silence she left behind was beginning to look permanent. Just as the investigation seemed destined to fade into the realm of local legend, a new thread emerged, thin and strange. It came from one of the oldest field hands, a man named Samuel, whose testimony had initially been dismissed. Samuel, emboldened by the sheriff's patient questioning, sought him out privately. He spoke of something he'd heard on the night Alara vanished, the night of the violent thunderstorm. He had been in his cabin, close to the edge of the woods, not far from the pig enclosures. Through the howling wind and crashing rain, he swore he heard strange sounds coming from the direction of the pigsty. He was insistent that these were not the usual grunts and squeals of the animals. He described the sound as a frantic, high-pitched squealing, punctuated by a rhythmic, wet, chopping noise. And underneath it all, he claimed to have heard something else, something that made the hair on his arm stand up, a low, steady humming like a lullaby sung in a minor key. At the time, he had dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on his ears, the storm making the familiar sounds of the farm seem alien and menacing. But in the weeks since the mistress's disappearance, the memory of that sound had haunted him, growing more sinister in his mind. The sheriff listened intently, his expression grim. It was the stuff of folklore, a ghost story born of fear and superstition. A court of law would laugh at such testimony. And yet, it was the first new piece of information he'd had in days. It was a strange, disturbing detail that didn't fit with any of the prevailing theories. The eye Magic conjured was deeply macabre, a raging storm, the frantic squealing of pigs, and a mysterious, rhythmic chopping in the dark. It was a chilling symphony of the forbidden. Samuel's story, as spectral and unreliable as it was, lodged itself in Sheriff Blackwood's mind and refused to let go. It was a loose thread, and he felt compelled to pull it. It led him back to the one place on the plantation that seemed to radiate a palpable sense of wrongness, the pigsty. This visit was different from his first. He was no longer just looking for a dropped locket. He was looking for confirmation of a horrifying, half-formed theory that he barely dared to articulate to himself. He approached the enclosure slowly, the same foul stench greeting him like an old, unwelcome acquaintance. He stood at the fence, observing the animals within. The Hemlock pigs were not ordinary farm animals. They were a large, aggressive breed, left to run semi-wild in their vast, muddy enclosure. They were notoriously voracious, capable of cracking bone with their powerful jaws. Thaddeus Hemlock had often boasted that they would eat anything you put in front of them. As Blackwood watched, the pigs stared back, their small, intelligent eyes seeming to follow his every move. There was a primitive, unsettling menace in their gaze. They were creatures of pure, uncomplicated appetite. He thought of Samuel's story, the frantic squealing, the chopping sound. He imagined the scene under the lashing rain, the darkness broken only by flashes of lightning. The theory taking shape in his mind was monstrous, almost unthinkable. It defied all civilized logic. But out here, in this place of mud and filth, surrounded by these primal creatures, the rules of the civilized world felt very far away. He knew what he had to do next. It would be a disgusting, grim task, but he could no longer ignore the possibility that the answer to Alara Hemlock's disappearance was not buried in the woods or at the bottom of the river, but lay somewhere beneath the churning, fetid surface of this very enclosure. The decision was made. Sheriff Blackwood deputized 4 reluctant farmhands, ordering them to begin the grim task of searching the pigsty. The first step was to isolate the animals. The massive, agitated pigs were herded into a smaller, adjacent pen, their furious squeals echoing across the unnervingly quiet plantation. Once the main enclosure was empty of its inhabitants, the true horror of the task became apparent. The area was a quagmire of mud, animal waste, and rotting food scraps, several feet deep in some places. The stench was overwhelming, a physical force that made the men gag and their eyes water. Armed with shovels and pitchforks, they began. The work was slow, disgusting, and demoralizing. Every shovelful of the viscous, stinking muck seemed to reveal only more of the same. The sun beat down, intensifying the foul odor and attracting swarms of black flies. The men worked in near silence, their faces grim masks of revulsion. For hours their labor yielded nothing. The mud clung to their boots and clothes, a foul baptism into the darkest secrets of the farm. Sheriff Blackwood stood by, watching, his own stomach churning. He was beginning to doubt himself, to wonder if he was chasing a ghost story, subjecting these men to this macabre ordeal for nothing. The hope for a quick discovery faded, replaced by the grim, monotonous rhythm of shovels plunging into filth. It felt like an archaeological dig into the very heart of hell. They were not just sifting through mud, they were sifting through a primal soup of decay, a place where the lines between animal and vegetable, life and death, had been completely erased. Each passing moment without a discovery made the entire endeavor feel more and more like an act of collective madness. The sun was beginning its slow descent towards the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the plantation, when a shout broke the grim silence. One of the men, a young farmhand named Silas, stood frozen, his shovel held aloft. Impaled on one of its prongs was a small, tattered piece of fabric. It wasn't the rough-spun cloth of a servant's dress or the burlap of a feed sack. It was silk. Fine, imported silk, the color of a summer sky. Even caked in filth and torn at the edges, its quality was unmistakable. Sheriff Blackwood moved quickly, taking the fabric from the shovel. He rinsed it carefully in a bucket of water. As the mud washed away, a delicate, embroidered pattern of white flowers was revealed. He had seen that pattern before, in a portrait of Alara that hung in the main hall. Thaddeus had also described it in detail. It was from the dress she was wearing on the day she disappeared. A collective shudder went through the small group of men. The abstract horror of their task had suddenly become terrifyingly concrete. This was no longer a wild goose chase based on a whispered rumor. This was evidence. The discovery electrified T. He searched. The men, their revulsion now mixed with a morbid, fearful excitement, attacked the mud with a renewed, frantic energy. They were no longer just digging, they were exhuming. The pigsty had transformed from a simple animal enclosure into a potential gravesite, a macabre tomb where the victim had been consumed by her own livestock. The single piece of blue silk, a remnant of wealth and beauty found in the most squalid of places, was a silent, damning testament to a horrifying crime. Alara Hemlock had been here. The only question that remained was what had happened to the rest of her. The discovery of the silk scrap fundamentally altered the nature of the search. Sheriff Blackwood realized that a simple sifting with shovels was no longer sufficient. If there was more to be found, it was likely to be small, fragmented, and easily missed. A new, more painstaking methodology was required. He sent one man back to the barns to fetch several large wooden sieves used for sifting grain. His plan was as methodical as it was gruesome. The men would now dig out the muck shovel by shovel, load it onto a wheelbarrow, and transport it to a section of cleared, grassy ground. There, they would dump the foul contents and begin the horrifying process of washing and sifting it, as if they were panning for gold in a river of filth. It was an unprecedented order, a procedure born of a desperate, macabre necessity. The psychological toll on the men was immense. They were being asked to systematically search through the excrement of the very animals they were now beginning to suspect were instruments of a terrible crime. Every stick, every stone, every piece of refuse they touched was now fraught with horrifying possibility. As the new, slower process began, the sun dipped below the trees and torches were lit, casting a flickering, hellish glow over the scene. The work continued into the twilight, the rhythmic sounds of shoveling and the sloshing of water creating a grim, industrial soundscape. The pigs in the adjacent pen watched the proceedings, their grunts and squeals seeming to take on a mocking, knowing tone. The men worked on, their faces illuminated by the dancing torchlight, looking like damned souls condemned to a uniquely foul corner of Dante's Inferno. They were no longer just men doing a job. They were participants in a dark ritual of discovery, unearthing a forbidden history, one handful of filth at a time. The sifting process went on for what felt like an eternity. The pile of processed, clean mud grew, but for a long time it yielded nothing more than refuse and stones. The initial adrenaline of the silk discovery had worn off, replaced again by a weary, nauseated dread. Then another discovery. This time it wasn't fabric. One of the sieves caught something small and white. At first glance, it looked like a chicken bone or some other piece of kitchen scrap. But when the sheriff cleaned it, he saw that it was different. It was denser, and one end showed a clear, sharp break. It was a fragment of a much larger bone. A short while later, another piece was found, and then another. They were all small, splintered, and showed signs of having been gnawed and crushed. Blackwood, who had seen his share of death and decay, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. While he was no medical expert, he knew enough to recognize that these fragments were inconsistent with the bones of any small animal. Their size and density suggested something larger. The horrifying puzzle was assembling itself, piece by splintered piece. The logic was as inescapable as it was monstrous. The pigs, with their powerful jaws, would not have swallowed bones whole. They would have crushed them, breaking them down into smaller, more manageable pieces, just like these. The men fell silent, their shovels moving with a heavy, somnolent rhythm. The macabre nature of their work had reached a new peak. They were now collecting the fragmented, processed remains of a human being. The torn dress had suggested a victim. These bone shards were the first horrifying hints of the body itself, a body that had been systematically destroyed, consumed, and scattered, leaving only these tiny, chilling clues behind. As the night deepened, the pile of sifted earth grew, and with it, the small, horrifying collection of evidence. A button made of mother-of-pearl, a shard of a porcelain hairpin, and more splinters of bone. Each discovery was another nail in the coffin of a terrible, emerging truth. And then came the final, irrefutable piece of proof. A heavy, metallic clink sounded as a shovelful of mud was dumped into a sieve. The object that remained after the water washed the filth away was unmistakable. It was the locket, the very one Blackwood had first discovered, but now, seeing it again in the context of the bone fragments and the torn silk, it took on a new, profound significance. This was the object that tied everything together. It was intimate, personal, and undeniably Alara's. Blackwood picked it up, the cold metal feeling heavy with the weight of the crime. He ran his thumb over the tarnished gold surface and opened the clasp again. He looked at the shattered miniature portraits inside. This time he saw something he hadn't noticed before. The damage to the tiny paintings wasn't random. It looked deliberate. The faces had been deeply scratched, obliterated by a sharp point, as if in an act of profound rage and desecration. It was an act of symbolic violence, a final, vicious insult. This wasn't just evidence of a murder, it was a clue to the killer's state of mind. It spoke of a hatred that went beyond the act of killing, a desire to erase not just the person but the very memory of them. The locket was the period at the end of a horrifying sentence. With this in his hand, Blackwood knew he had enough. The search was over. The physical evidence, though circumstantial, painted a narrative so clear and so deeply disturbing that it could no longer be ignored. He now had to confront the only person who could fill in the final, gruesome details. Sheriff Blackwood walked away from the flickering torchlight of the pigsty, the small, horrifying collection of evidence wrapped in a piece of cloth in his hand. The stench of the place clung to him, a foul reminder of the truth he had unearthed. The case was no longer a mystery but a problem of confession. The circumstantial evidence was strong, perhaps strong enough for a conviction in a world that already wanted to believe in the suspect's guilt. But Blackwood wanted more. He needed to hear it. He needed the story, the why and the how, to make sense of an act so fundamentally senseless. He needed to understand the sequence of events that could lead a human being to commit such a monstrous, almost primal act of disposal. He walked toward the main house, his mind a whirlwind of macabre imagery. The torn silk, the splintered bone, the scratched locket, the frantic squealing of the pigs in the storm. The pieces of his investigation, once disparate and confusing, now clicked into place, forming a single horrifying mosaic. He had a theory, a detailed, step-by-step reconstruction of the crime. He envisioned the final confrontation, the act of violence born of years of abuse, the panicked decision in the aftermath, and the descent into a truly unspeakable method of concealment. It was a narrative of pure Gothic horror, a story that belonged in the forbidden, penny-dreadful novels that were becoming popular in the cities, not in the sun-drenched reality of a Virginia plantation. But the evidence in his hand told him otherwise. He had unearthed a truth more macabre than any fiction. Now, he had to look into the eyes of the young woman at the center of it all and force her to speak it aloud. The final confrontation was at hand. The second interrogation took place in the same small office, but the atmosphere had changed entirely. The air was thick with unspoken knowledge. When Grace was brought in, she saw the small pile of objects laid out neatly on the table between her and the sheriff. The torn blue silk, the pearl button, the bone fragments, and in the center, the damning locket. Her eyes, which had been so placid and empty before, flickered for a single, almost imperceptible moment. It was the only sign of recognition she gave. Sheriff Blackwood did not speak at first. He simply sat, letting the silence and the weight of the evidence on the table do the work for him. He watched her, waiting for the confession, the tears, the breakdown that he knew must come. But it did not. Grace looked at the remnants of her mistress, the pathetic collection of debris that was all that was left of the powerful Elara Hemlock, and her expression began to change. Her lips, which had been set in a firm, neutral line, slowly began to curl upwards at the corners. A faint, knowing smile touched her mouth. It was not a smile of joy or relief. It was a cold, empty, chillingly serene expression. It was the smile of someone who had passed through the gates of hell and found them to be of no consequence. The sight of it was more terrifying to Blackwood than any scream or violent outburst could have been. The composure had not just cracked, it had been replaced by something far more disturbing. This was not denial and it was not remorse. It was acknowledgement. It was ownership. The smile was a silent confession, more powerful and more horrifying than any words she could have spoken. "Tell me what you did," Sheriff Blackwood said, his voice a low growl. The smile on Grace's face faded, replaced by that same unnerving calm. She looked at him, her gaze direct and unflinching for the first time. And then she began to speak. Her voice was soft, almost conversational, as if she were recounting a recipe or describing a day's chores. There were no tears, no hysterics, no pleas for mercy. It was a confession delivered as a simple, factual report. She started not with the murder, but with the abuse. She spoke of years of quiet suffering, of the daily humiliations, the casual violence, the slow, systematic stripping away of her humanity. She described Elara not as a person, but as a force, a relentless pressure that had been squeezing the life out of her day by day. Her account was chillingly detached, her words painting a vivid picture of a life lived in constant, low-grade terror. Then she came to the day Elara vanished. She recounted the false accusation of the stolen music box, the public shearing of her hair. She described the feeling of absolute emptiness that followed, the sensation of something inside her finally breaking. It was, she explained, as if a string that had been pulled taut for years had finally snapped. She felt no anger, no sadness. She felt nothing at all. It was in this state of complete emotional detachment, she said, that she went about her duties for the rest of the afternoon, waiting for her mistress to summon her again. She knew there would be more, that the discovery of the music box would not bring an apology, but perhaps even another punishment for having caused Elara the trouble of being wrong. She was simply waiting for the next blow to fall. The summons came after dusk as the storm was beginning to gather. Elara called Grace to her private sitting room. The music box was on the table. Elara did not apologize. Instead, she began to berate Grace anew, accusing her of being clumsy, of making her mistress look foolish. In Grace's retelling, the words seemed to come from a great distance. They had lost their power to wound her. She stood silently as Elara raged, her voice growing shriller, her face contorted with fury. Then Elara picked up a heavy silver-backed hairbrush from her vanity. It was an object Grace knew well. She had used it to brush her mistress's hair 1,000 times. Elara advanced on her, the brush raised. It was a familiar ritual, the prelude to a beating. But this time something was different. As the brush swung towards her head, Grace, for the first time in her life, raised a hand to block it. The act was pure instinct, not a conscious decision. The shock on Alara's face was absolute. It was the shock of an owner whose property had suddenly, inexplicably defied her. She shrieked, a sound of pure, entitled rage, and lunged again. What happened next, Grace described as a blur, a clumsy, desperate struggle. She did not speak of a clear intent to kill. She spoke of a tangle of limbs, of pushing, of shoving. Alara, unaccustomed to physical resistance, lost her footing on the polished wooden floor. She fell backward, her head striking the sharp corner of the stone fireplace with a sickening, hollow crack. And then there was silence. A sudden, profound silence in the room, broken only by the sound of the rising wind outside. Alara Hemlock lay still on the floor, her eyes wide open, staring at nothing. The years of torment, the constant pressure, the daily fear, it had all ended in a single, clumsy moment of impact. In the chilling silence of the room, with the storm now raging outside, Grace described a feeling not of panic, but of strange, cold clarity. The problem of Alara Hemlock was solved, but a new, more practical problem had presented itself: the body. She knew that what had happened would not be seen as self-defense. It would be seen as the murder of a mistress by her slave, the ultimate transgression, a crime for which the punishment would be swift and terrible. She had to make the body disappear, completely. Her mind, she said, worked with a ruthless efficiency she didn't know she possessed. She thought of the woods, but the ground was hard, and digging a grave would take too long. She thought of the river, but bodies had a way of resurfacing. And then another thought came to her, a memory seeded by her mistress's own dark words. She remembered Alara in a foul mood one afternoon, watching the pigs being fed. She had laughed and remarked to a guest how her husband's pigs were so voracious they would eat a fallen horse to the bone in a single night. The casual, cruel remark, forgotten by everyone who heard it, had lodged in Grace's mind. It now returned to her not as a piece of dark humor, but as a practical, horrifying solution. The pigs. They would eat anything. They would leave nothing behind. The plan was monstrous, a solution born from the darkest corners of the human imagination. But in that moment, in that silent room with the body of her tormentor at her feet, it seemed not only possible, but perfectly logical. It was a form of justice that was as poetic as it was macabre. Alara would be consumed by the very filth and gluttony that her own plantation fostered. The most disturbing part of Grace's confession was the calm, methodical detail with which she described what came next. This was the part of the story that would later be whispered about in hushed, horrified tones for generations. This was the act that would cement her legend as something more than a mere killer. With the storm providing cover, she said she waited until the house was dark and silent. Then, she began the arduous task of moving the body. She wrapped Alara in a heavy quilt from her own bed to staunch the bleeding and muffle any sound. She described the dead weight of the woman who had been so full of sharp, angry energy just hours before. She dragged her through the dark corridors of the house, out a back door, and across the muddy, rain-lashed courtyard. The journey to the pigsty was a grim, exhausting ordeal. Once there, she was faced with the final, horrifying step of her plan. She knew the pigs would not be able to consume the body whole. It had to be processed. Using a small, sharp axe from the woodpile, she began the methodical and gruesome work of dismemberment. She spoke of this not with relish or glee, but with the detached focus of a butcher preparing meat. The rhythmic chopping sound, the sound that old Samuel had heard through the storm, was not a product of his imagination. It was the sound of Grace reducing her mistress to manageable pieces, a task performed under the flashes of lightning, her face and clothes spattered with blood and rain. If you find yourself captivated by these chilling tales from the forgotten archives of history, support our channel by liking this video and subscribing. We are committed to unearthing the most disturbing and forbidden stories, and your support allows us to continue this dark journey into the past. With the gruesome preparation complete, Grace began the final stage of her horrifying plan. One by one, she introduced the pieces of what was once a Lara hemlock into the pigsty. She described the reaction of the animals. Stirred by the scent of blood, they became a frenzy of squealing, snorting gluttony. There was no hesitation. They fell upon the offering with a primal, ravenous hunger. In her confession, Grace said she did not turn away. She watched. She stood in the driving rain, a silent, solitary witness to this macabre feast. For her, this was not just about disposing of evidence. It was a ritual. It was the ultimate act of erasure. Every sound of cracking bone, every rapacious bite the animals took, was a moment of her own suffering being undone. The woman who had tried to erase her dignity was now being physically, fundamentally, erased from the world. Over the course of that long, stormy night, and for a few nights that followed, she disposed of the entire body in this manner, ensuring nothing remained. The sounds that had so terrified old Samuel were, for Grace, a form of twisted vindication. The ravenous hunger of the pigs became a tool of her vengeance, a natural process she had simply co-opted for her own terrifying purpose. She was not just hiding a crime. She was feeding her pain to the beasts, watching as they consumed her past, transforming her tormentor into nothing more than filth and memory. The pigs in her story became the final, horrifying arbiters of a justice the world would never have given her. Grace's confession, detailed and unrepentant, sent a shockwave of horror through the county. The story spread like wildfire, carried by gossiping neighbors and traveling merchants. It was a tale so gruesome, so profoundly outside the bounds of normal human behavior, that it immediately transcended the realm of simple crime and entered the domain of legend. The truth was far more horrifying than any of the rumors had been. Grace was no longer just a suspected killer. She was transformed into a monstrous figure, a folk devil. The community reacted with a mixture of revulsion and a strange, morbid fascination. She became the embodiment of their deepest fears, the simmering rage of the oppressed, the potential for savage violence lurking just beneath the placid surface of their rigidly ordered society. Her name became a forbidden word, a byword for ultimate transgression. Mothers began to use her story to frighten their children into obedience. Be good, or Grace will come and feed you to the pigs. The hemlock plantation, Whispering Pines, was now seen as a place of profound contamination, a tainted ground where an unspeakable act had occurred. The story of what Grace did was so disturbing that it was effectively banned from polite conversation. It was too visceral, too close to the bone, a horrifying reminder of the brutality that underpinned their entire way of life. While they condemned her as a monster, they could not stop talking about her, ensuring that the tale of the housemaid and her cruel mistress would be seared into the local consciousness forever. The legal proceedings that followed Grace's confession were a mere formality, a piece of theater designed to uphold the pretense of justice. Her trial was swift, brutal, and its outcome was never in doubt. She was taken to the county seat and held in a small, stone cell. The trial itself lasted less than a day. Grace was provided with a court-appointed lawyer who offered only a token defense. The concept that her actions could have been the result of years of horrific abuse, what a modern court might consider extreme provocation or a product of battered person syndrome, was utterly alien to the legal framework of 1835. The law did not recognize the humanity of the enslaved, let alone their psychological suffering. To the court, the circumstances were simple. Property had destroyed its owner. Grace stood before the judge and jury, exhibiting the same unnerving calm she had shown Sheriff Blackwood. She did not plead for her life. She did not express remorse. She simply listened as her own detailed, horrifying confession was read aloud, damning her in her own words. The jury, composed entirely of white, landowning men, men who were themselves slave owners, deliberated for less than 15 minutes. The verdict was returned as everyone expected, guilty of the crime of murder. The courtroom was silent as the judge, a stern-faced man with a reputation for harsh sentences, prepared to deliver his judgment. For the people of the county, this was the final act, the moment where the world would be set right and the monster would be condemned. The sentence handed down was death by hanging. It was the only possible punishment for a crime of such magnitude. Grace received the news with the same placid, unreadable expression she had worn throughout the entire ordeal. She was returned to her cell to await the date of her execution, which was set for 2 weeks hence. The community breathed a collective sigh of relief. The monster had been caged and would soon be dispatched, allowing the disturbing affair to finally be put to rest. But the story was not over. In the weeks between the sentencing and the scheduled execution, strange things began to happen back at the Whispering Pines plantation. A creeping rot, it was said, began to set in. Thaddeus Hemlock, now a broken and haunted man, tried to restore order to his shattered world. He had the entire stock of pigs slaughtered and their bodies burned, attempting to purge the land of their tainted presence. But the act seemed to do nothing. A mysterious blight fell upon the tobacco fields closest to the house, turning the leaves black and brittle on the stalk. The other livestock, the cows and chickens, grew sick and listless. A palpable sense of gloom settled over the estate. A place that had once been a symbol of wealth and power now felt like a mausoleum. Servants began to whisper of seeing a spectral figure, a woman in a fine silk dress, wandering the halls of the great house at night, searching for something she could never find. The place was no longer just a plantation. It was becoming a haunted ground, a place marked by a stain that no amount of time or fire could cleanse. The story of the Hemlock plantation's decline became an epilogue to Grace's horrifying tale. The phenomena grew stranger, more pronounced. The curse, as the locals began to call it, was relentless. Thaddeus Hemlock, once a proud and commanding figure, devolved into a paranoid recluse. He was said to spend his days drinking heavily in his study, starting at shadows, and his nights pacing the halls, calling out his dead wife's name. He complained of a constant, faint smell of decay that no one else could detect, a phantom stench that followed him from room to room. He became convinced that the land itself was punishing him, that Grace's act had unleashed a malevolent force that was now poisoning his entire world. The other servants, terrified by the oppressive atmosphere and the master's descent into madness, began to flee the plantation, risking the terrible punishments for runaways rather than spend another night in the cursed house. Within a year of Alara's death, Whispering Pines was a ghost of its former self. The fields lay fallow, the outbuildings were falling into disrepair, and the grand house was silent and shuttered. Thaddeus, completely alone, was eventually found dead in his study, having taken his own life. The curse of Whispering Pines had claimed its final victim. The story served as a chilling cautionary tale in the region for decades to come, a warning that some acts are so profoundly evil, they leave a permanent scar not just on the people involved, but on the very earth where they occurred. After the death of Thaddeus Hemlock, the plantation was seized by his creditors, but no one wanted to buy it. The story of the housemaid, the cruel mistress, and the pigs had become so deeply ingrained in the local folklore that the land was considered irrevocably tainted. Whispering Pines was abandoned. Nature, patient and relentless, began its slow work of reclamation. Weeds choked the once manicured gardens, vines crept up the columns of the great house, and the roof of the main structure eventually collapsed, leaving it open to the elements. The place became a ruin, a skeletal monument to the Hemlock family's tragic downfall. Locals avoided the area entirely, especially after dark. The stories, however, lived on, growing more fantastical with each telling. They said that on moonless nights, you could still hear the frantic squealing of pigs coming from the overgrown hollow where the sty once stood. Some claimed to have seen the ghost of Grace herself, a silent figure standing guard over the ruins, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The story of what happened there was too horrifying for official histories, a piece of local lore that was banned from respectable conversation, yet it thrived in the shadows. It became a permanent part of the region's psychic landscape, a forbidden tale whispered around campfires, a dark narrative woven into the fabric of the place. The abandoned plantation was no longer just a piece of property. It was a memorial to a macabre crime, a physical manifestation of a history too disturbing to confront directly. Looking back at the case of Grace from the distance of history, the narrative becomes more complex. In her time, she was seen as a monster, a demonic figure who committed an act of unimaginable savagery. Her story was used as a tool to reinforce the existing power structure, a terrifying example of what could happen if the natural order was challenged. But through a modern lens, the story shifts. The horror of her act remains, undeniable and visceral. Yet it becomes impossible to separate her crime from the relentless, soul-crushing brutality she endured. Was her act one of pure madness, the result of a mind finally snapping under unbearable pressure? Or was it something else entirely? Could it be seen as a horrifying, twisted act of rebellion? In a system that denied her any legal or moral recourse, a system that defined her as less than human, she chose to respond with a form of justice that was as primal and as absolute as the power wielded against her. She did not just kill her oppressor, she annihilated her, erasing her from existence using the very tools of the farm that her labor sustained. It's a deeply uncomfortable thought. The story forces us to confront the moral ambiguity at the heart of extreme oppression. It raises a chilling question. When a system is monstrous, what does resistance look like? Grace's solution was undeniably a nightmare, but it was a nightmare born from the waking hell of her own life. Her legacy is therefore dual. She is both a macabre monster and a terrifying symbol of vengeance against an inhuman system. The official record, the one written in the neat, cursive hand of the county clerk, is simple and clear. It states that Grace, convicted of the murder of her mistress, was executed by hanging on the scheduled date in the public square, before a crowd of silent onlookers. Her body, the record notes, was buried in an unmarked grave in the potter's field behind the church. It is a neat, tidy end to a messy and disturbing story. This is the version that history remembers, the official account that closes the book on the horrifying events at Whispering Pines. But folklore offers a different ending. An alternate, more mysterious narrative persisted for decades, whispered by the descendants of those who lived in the county at the time. This version of the story claims that on the night before her scheduled execution, Grace simply vanished from her locked cell. There was no sign of a breakout, no broken bars or forced doors. The guards on duty swore they heard nothing. She was there at the evening's final check, and gone by morning, as if she had turned to smoke and drifted out through the cracks in the stone. Some said a sympathetic jailer had let her go. Others whispered that something more supernatural was at play, that the dark forces she had communed with to commit her crime had come to claim her. This ending leaves the story fundamentally unresolved, transforming Grace from a convicted killer into a legendary figure, a ghost who slipped through the fingers of justice and disappeared back into the shadows from which she came. It is an ending that denies the community the closure of her death, leaving her specter to haunt their imagination forever. Whether she was executed or vanished, Grace's story left an indelible mark. The ruins of the hemlock plantation are said to still exist, hidden deep within a tract of privately owned timberland in rural Virginia. The main house has long since collapsed into a pile of rubble and rotting wood, and the outbuildings have been completely swallowed by the forest. But local explorers and ghost hunters who claim to have found the site report that the foundation of the old pigsty is still visible, a faint, stone rectangle on the forest floor. They speak of an unnatural coldness in that specific spot, a deep, penetrating chill that has nothing to do with the weather. They describe a feeling of profound dread, of being watched by unseen eyes, and an overwhelming, inexplicable sense of sorrow. That seems to rise from the earth itself. The case of Alara Hemlock's disappearance was, in a legal sense, solved. A confession was obtained, a verdict was delivered, and a punishment was decreed. And yet the story feels fundamentally unfinished. It remains a cold case of the soul. The full truth of what happened in Grace's mind, the precise alchemy of suffering and rage that led to such a macabre and creative act of violence, is something we can never truly know. It is locked away in the past, as lost and irretrievable as the body of her mistress. The official record closes the file, but the lingering horror, the moral ambiguity, and the chilling questions it raises ensure that the case is never truly closed. The tale of Grace and Alara Hemlock is a grim reminder that history is not just a collection of dates and facts, but a tapestry of human passion, cruelty, and desperation. It is a story that forces us to look into the abyss, to confront the terrifying potential that lies dormant within the human heart when it is pushed to its absolute limit. It is a narrative of forbidden vengeance, a crime so perfectly, horrifyingly tailored to the victim that it becomes a dark reflection of the world that created it. The central chilling question of the story is not simply what happened, but what is more horrifying. Is it the macabre, unspeakable act of feeding a human being to pigs? Or is it the slow, systematic, and socially accepted cruelty that could drive someone to conceive of such an act in the first place? The story provides no easy answers. It leaves us in the oppressive silence that followed the final, violent confrontation in Alara's sitting room. It leaves us with the image of a young woman, stripped of everything, standing in a raging storm, watching as the beasts consume her tormentor. It is a permanent, dark stain on the landscape of the past, a story that lingers in the air like the foul, sweet smell of decay that first greeted Sheriff Blackwood. It is a reminder that some histories are not meant to be neatly filed away and forgotten. They are meant to haunt us,